The restaurant's polished floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers as the evening unfolded, and in the midst of it all, Deborah navigated the crowd with the precision of someone who had learned to move in the background. She had mastered the art of blending in, disappearing among the sea of black and white uniforms, and yet there was something about her, an undeniable spark that those who paid attention might see, like a glimmer of light at the edges of a dark room. It was a skill she had honed over the years, the ability to remain unnoticed. Yet tonight, she couldn't shake the sensation that this evening would be different. It was as though the universe had orchestrated this night for something far beyond a mere dinner service. Leonard Grayson had that kind of presence, the kind that demanded attention as if the mere act of entering a room was an event in itself. The subtle rustle of his tailored suit, the tilt of his chin, the arrogant way he surveyed everything around him, all of it was as calculated as the business deals he made. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a man whose name commanded both awe and fear. But in reality, he was nothing more than a man who thrived on dominance, who prided himself on having control over everything in his life, and everyone in it. As Leonard's sharp eyes caught Deborah's figure weaving between tables, a fleeting moment passed, unnoticed by most but felt deeply by her. That glance, laced with something beyond curiosity, something darker, lingered in the air. It wasn't a look of admiration or even interest. It was a challenge, one that sent a shiver down her spine. She could feel it, the power dynamic shift in the very air around them, as though her role had already been decided for her. In Leonard's eyes, she was nothing more than a means to entertain his boredom. He didn't see her as a person. She was simply a tool to feed his ego. But Deborah was no stranger to being underestimated. It had happened time and time again, ever since she was a girl. When her mother had worked tirelessly to keep their family afloat, when Deborah had played on that old out-of-tune piano, the world hadn't bothered to see her potential. No one cared to listen to the way her fingers danced across the keys, how the sound of the music became her escape from the crushing weight of reality. No one cared that she had a dream that stretched far beyond this restaurant, far beyond the small, crowded apartment she called home. And yet, here she was, in the very place that should have crushed her spirit, surrounded by the rich and powerful who thought they could control the world with their wealth. But Leonard Grayson had no idea who he was dealing with. He would soon learn. The night, which had started as a simple evening of service, began to shift in Deborah's chest. Each plate she delivered, each smile she offered, carried the weight of Leonard's gaze, following her every move like a hawk ready to strike. The air around her felt thick with tension, a silent battle she hadn't agreed to fight yet found herself trapped in. She had come to La Fontaine not just for the paycheck, but for the grand piano tucked quietly into the corner, its black and white keys resting there as a reminder of everything she had once dreamed of. She hardly had time to play it, but just knowing it was there brought her a sense of peace, a promise that her passion, her music, would always be close by. And so, she kept her distance from the piano, living her life in the restaurant's rhythmic chaos, each passing day a faint echo of the music that still lived in her soul. But tonight was different. Tonight, the hum of conversation felt less like background noise and more like the prelude to something inevitable. Leonard, with his commanding presence, was making her feel as if every action she took was under a microscope. He, along with his entourage, seemed to exist in a different world, one where the rules of politeness and respect didn't apply. As she approached their table, her tray balanced with precision, Leonard's sharp voice broke through the usual dinner clatter. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, glancing at her name tag. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The comment came out of nowhere, and for a split second, Deborah froze. She hadn't expected this. His eyes, dark and calculating, studied her for a moment longer than necessary. She offered a polite smile, trying to steer the conversation back to the orders she needed to take, but his words were like a seed planted in the air, making her uneasy. As she walked away to place their order, she didn't notice the sly grin exchanged between Leonard and his companion, nor the way his eyes tracked her every step. But Deborah didn't need to be told what he was doing. She had seen this kind of manipulation before: the subtle power plays, the quiet jabs, the push for someone to reveal themselves when they weren't ready. Leonard Grayson wasn't just a customer. He was a predator in a polished suit, and she was just another target. The night continued, the laughter of the crowd mingling with the clink of silverware, but Deborah couldn't shake the strange energy emanating from Leonard. He wasn't simply rude. He was orchestrating a spectacle, and she was the unwilling star. By the time the appetizers were served, his performance was in full swing. Leonard had begun recounting exaggerated tales of his wealth and success, each story designed to elevate himself while putting others down. His entourage hung on his every word, laughing at all the right moments. But it wasn't the laughter that drew Deborah's attention. It was the way his eyes gleamed whenever they landed on her. As she moved back to their table with a bottle of wine, Leonard's voice rang out, cutting through the noise like a blade. "Tell me, Deborah," he began, his tone dripping with amusement. "What do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." His words, casual as they seemed, struck her with a force she hadn't expected. They weren't a simple question. They were an invitation to something darker, a challenge. Deborah hesitated, the weight of his gaze heavy on her, and answered carefully, "I play piano sometimes." She hoped the answer would end the conversation, but Leonard's eyes lit up with a dangerous spark. "A pianist, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" The room seemed to go still. For a brief moment, the noise around them faded, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat, frantic and loud in her chest. Deborah froze. She felt every eye on her, the heat of their stares burning through her. A challenge. He had issued a challenge, and now the room awaited her response. "I couldn't," she said quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard was relentless, his voice rising above the chatter, drawing the attention of everyone around. "Nonsense," he boomed. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely someone with a future like yours isn't afraid of a little audience." Deborah's chest tightened. The moment stretched, heavy with judgment, with ridicule, and with the silent expectation that she would back down, that she would run from the humiliation he had carefully crafted for her. The room had turned into a stage, and she was the unwilling performer. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but his words held her captive. "I really shouldn't," she stammered, glancing around for support. But no one stepped in, not even her colleagues, who seemed to shrink back, unsure of whether to intervene. Leonard leaned back in his chair, savoring the discomfort he had created, taking a slow sip of his scotch with a smirk. "I see," he said, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The words hit her like a slap. Deborah's hands clenched at her sides. He had done it. He had reduced her to nothing more than an object of ridicule, dismissing her as if she were nothing at all. But it wasn't just his words that stung. It was the way they made her feel small, like the very thing she loved most had been taken from her, mocked in front of a crowd. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, strong, comforting, and resolute. "Never let anyone make you small." At that moment, something shifted within Deborah. The weight of his challenge, the mockery, it all became fuel. But as witnesses to something that transcended the moment. The weight of their stares was no longer a burden but a recognition, a silent acknowledgement that she had just stepped into her power. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline coursing through her veins like wildfire, but there was a strange sense of peace in the air now. The music had been her sanctuary, her escape from the confines of her day-to-day life, and now, for the first time, it had done more than just soothe her soul. It had redefined her. Deborah took a slow breath, allowing herself to feel the rush of emotions that had been locked inside her for so long. Fear, anger, hope, love. They all came pouring out with every note, every chord that had left her fingertips and filled the room. She had feared this moment, dreaded it in the quiet corners of her mind, but now that it had passed, she realized something profound. She had nothing to prove. The music had done the proving for her. She looked across the room, her eyes meeting the gaze of one diner who had looked at her with casual indifference just moments ago. Now, he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Another table, where a couple had been whispering amid Leonard's spectacle, now sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with something deeper than surprise, respect, perhaps, or maybe awe. Leonard's clapping was slow, almost mechanical, as though he was struggling to process the unexpected shift that had just taken place. His expression was a strange mix of disbelief and discomfort, as if he had been caught in a trap of his own making. He wasn't used to being outshone, least of all by someone like her. For a moment, Deborah wondered if he was angry INF, he would lash out in the way she had feared. But when she looked at him again, something had changed in his eyes. The smugness, that false sense of superiority that had been his trademark, had faded. It had been replaced by a quiet resignation, as though he was forced to come to terms with the fact that he had just underestimated someone he had no business underestimating. Her colleagues, those who had watched from the sidelines, hesitant to intervene during the challenge, now looked at her as if seeing her in a new light. Their smiles were wide, their applause genuine. In their eyes, Deborah wasn't just the quiet waitress who moved between tables with grace. She was an artist, someone whose talent transcended the roles she had been assigned in life. As the applause continued, Deborah slowly stood, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she pushed herself off the piano bench. Her knees felt weak, but her back was straight, her posture proud. She felt different, as if she had shed the layers of doubt and self-criticism that had once held her in place. For a brief moment, she let herself stand in the center of the room, taking in the sound of the applause, the warmth of the recognition. It was as though the world had shifted, and she had found herself at the very center of it. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer just a dreamer, but someone whose talent had been laid bare for the world to see. She didn't need Leonard's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. The music had spoken for her, and in that moment, she realized that her dreams, though delayed, were not gone. They were alive, and no matter what anyone thought of her, nothing could extinguish the fire she had ignited within herself that night. As the final echoes of applause faded into the soft murmur of the room, Deborah stood taller, a sense of empowerment filling the spaces left by her fear. She knew, without a doubt, that this was a turning point. The girl who had once been silenced by life's expectations, by the weight of her circumstances, had found her voice, and nothing could take it from her now. At a table near the kitchen, the words lingered in her mind like a warm embrace. "You're incredible." It was a simple phrase, but it carried so much more than just flattery. It was recognition and acknowledgement of her worth, not just as a waitress, but as a person. She had spent so many years doubting herself, living in the shadows of her dreams, afraid to truly shine. But tonight, in front of these strangers, in front of Leonard and his entourage, she had stepped into the light, and for the first time, she had realized that she didn't need to ask for permission to be seen. Deborah took a deep breath, letting the words of encouragement wash over her. She smiled at the older woman, who seemed to recognize the shift in her energy, her quiet yet undeniable triumph. Incredible. It was the kind of word she had never expected to hear for herself, not from anyone, and certainly not from a stranger. But in that moment, it was exactly what she needed to hear. She didn't care about the rich clientele or their clinking glasses anymore. She had reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her confidence. The night went on, but the atmosphere had changed. Deborah's earlier unease was gone, replaced with something far more powerful, an inner strength that had always been there, waiting for her to recognize it. The room buzzed with a new energy now, a subtle undercurrent of respect that hadn't been there before. Even the quiet hum of the conversations, the clinking of silverware, and the soft jazz from the corner piano seemed to reflect this shift, as if the entire space was aware that something extraordinary had just happened. As she continued working, patrons began to stop her, offering more compliments, some subtle, some direct, all genuine. She moved from table to table, the quiet admiration in their eyes following her every step. The polite words, the kind nods, they all spoke volumes. Leonard's table, once the center of attention, had quieted. The air of superiority that had clung to them earlier had dissipated, leaving behind a palpable awkwardness. His companions, who had once laughed with such loud abandon at her expense, now exchanged uncomfortable glances. The tension between them was undeniable. Deborah had, in some ways, turned the tables. The very people who had expected her to cower had witnessed her rise, and now they were left unsure of how to react. Their earlier mockery had transformed into an uneasy silence. Deborah could feel their eyes on her, but this time, she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She was bigger than that now. She had been tested, pushed to the edge, and had come out stronger for it. She had faced the challenge head-on, and in doing so, had taken ownership of her own narrative. Leonard, meanwhile, remained seated, his discomfort palpable. His attempt to regain control with empty praise, Talent has come from the most surprising places, had only highlighted his inability to truly face the moment. He had tried to laugh it off, but the humor was gone, and in its place was the cold, hard reality of his miscalculation. He had expected her to falter, to shrink, to crumble under the weight of his challenge. Instead, she had risen to meet it, and now, the game had shifted irrevocably. Deborah didn't look at him again. She did not need to. She had already shown him everything he needed to see. She had won, not through confrontation, but through her authenticity, her own unshakable belief in the power of her gift. Her music had been her weapon, her words her shield, and together they had delivered a resounding message. As the night wore on, Deborah felt a quiet sense of pride settle into her chest. She hadn't just proven something to Leonard or to the room. She had proven something to herself. The weight of her dreams had always seemed too heavy to carry, but now it felt lighter. She had let go of the fear, the self-doubt that had once threatened to crush her. And in its place, she felt something else, a profound sense of belonging, a quiet assurance that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the corner, the piano sat silent, but it no longer felt like a distant dream. It was a part of her now, as much a part of her as her own hands, her own heart. She had taken the stage, if only for a moment, and in doing so, had claimed her place among the greats. Tonight, Deborah had done more than just play a song. She had rewritten the narrative of her life. And as the evening drew to a close, she knew one thing for certain. Her story was only just beginning. The applause from her performance still echoed in Deborah's mind as she made her way back home, the cool night air filling her lungs with a fresh sense of possibility. For the first time in ages, she felt the weight of uncertainty lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing could take that away from her. Not the mockery, not the hardships, and not the doubts that had clouded her path for so long. Walking through the city streets, her thoughts weren't on the confrontation with Leonard, nor the discomfort his words had tried to impose on her. They were on the future that now felt within reach. She thought of the piano lessons she could finally afford, the small but meaningful steps toward her dream of becoming the artist she had always longed to be. The tips from the night had been generous, more than enough to cover rent and still leave extra for those lessons. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. When she reached her apartment, she didn't rush to take off her shoes or collapse into bed. Instead, she sat on the old, worn bench in her small living room, her fingers gliding across the keys of her piano. The sound wasn't as rich or as full as the grand piano at Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, raw and genuine, and that was enough. That night, something shifted within her. It wasn't just about the performance. It was the realization that her talent was her own, and she didn't need to hide it or apologize for it. She didn't need anyone's approval to pursue her dreams. She had nothing left to prove, only to live authentically and embrace her craft. Days passed, and word of her performance spread, circulating among the patrons who had witnessed her remarkable moment. Deborah's humble, powerful act of resilience had left an impression, and soon a call came. It was a music producer from Nashville who had been at the restaurant that night. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but an opportunity to record a demo, something small, but enough to spark the dreams she had put on hold for so long. Deborah didn't hesitate to agree. It wasn't because she believed this would change her life overnight. It wasn't about instant success. It was about taking a step forward into the unknown without fear. She was no longer intimidated by the voice of doubt that had haunted her. She had realized that her greatest strength wasn't in her circumstances or her struggles. It was in her authenticity, her resilience, and the raw power of her passion. Leonard, for all his wealth and arrogance, was nothing but a reminder of the voices she had silenced in her life. He was the embodiment of the doubt she had carried with her, the insecurities projected onto her by people too afraid to face their limitations. But she had faced him, and with nothing but the purity of her music, she had claimed her victory. For those watching her story unfold, Deborah's message was simple. Never let someone else define your worth. There will always be people like Leonard projecting their fears and inadequacies onto others to feel powerful. But true power, as she had learned, comes from being rooted in who you are, from letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on its faded wood, Deborah smiled. Her journey was just beginning, and while there would be obstacles ahead, she felt ready for them. Because now, more than ever, she understood that her dreams weren't too big. They were exactly what she was meant to pursue. And with that, she asked herself, what about you? What dreams have you been holding back because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward now. If Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.